You are listening to Specifically for Seniors, a podcast designed for a vibrant and diverse senior community. I'm your host, Dr. Larry Barsh. Join me and a lineup of experts as we discuss a wide variety of topics that will empower, inform, entertain, and inspire as we celebrate the richness and wisdom of this incredible stage of life.
My guest today on Specifically for Seniors is a practicing rabbi and stand-up comedian. Bob Alper has been seen on Good Morning America, Showtime, the BBC, CNN, and he was featured on Extra, TV's top-rated entertainment program, immediately following a segment on the size of Jennifer Lopez's butt. I'm not sure really whether that's an appropriate way to introduce a rabbi, but it's too late now. Anyhow,
but it's true.
Welcome.
It's true.
Welcome to Specifically for Seniors, Bob.
Thank you, Larry. Nice to be here.
How do I now segue into a serious question and ask you how you became a rabbi? What got you into the clergy?
Well, if I were Mel Brooks, I would say I put my hand on a rock and I said, I am a rabbi, but it was more complicated than that. Becoming a rabbi was a very natural career choice for me. I was always interested in people. I majored in what was called social relations at Lehigh, which is anthropology, sociology, and social psychology. I knew I wanted a people-oriented career. My late uncle was a rabbi, a very important influence in my life. And so it was natural. It was not a theological choice. It was a choice of I'm proud and always excited about being a Jew and always wanted to work with people. So by the end of my senior year in college, I toyed with the idea and I decided, I'll go to seminary, try it out. And if I like it, I'll stay. I didn't like it, but it was a means to an end. And 6 years later, I was ordained as a rabbi.
You said that your rabbinate was about making people laugh.
Yeah, I've been doing comedy since 1988 full time. People always ask, "Are you still a rabbi?" And it took me a lot of years to realize and to articulate that there are lots of ways of functioning as a rabbi: congregational life, of course, academic life, chaplaincy, scholarship, all kinds of ways. And I realized my way of functioning as a rabbi was making people laugh. And there's a holiness to it. It's not just fun. It's not just diversion. There's a holiness to it. And the prime example I can give is my driver's license has a very funny picture on it. And with me mugging the camera, and I got away with it because I live in Vermont. And yesterday I was in a market getting coffee, I think, a 7-Eleven kind of store. And after I finished, the very dour, depressed looking clerk handed me my change. And I said, "Oh, and I want to show you my driver's license." She said, "I don't need to look at you." I said, "No, I want to show it to you." She said, "All right." And I showed her this ridiculous looking picture of me and my driver. And she brightened and she smiled and she laughed and she called her colleague over to look at it. And they had a little party. And I walked away feeling really good. And I do that all the time. And, it's bringing joy to people's lives, whether it's through using my driver's license, whether it's making a joke, lightening people up. Another quick example, when I pull out of a car rental place, there's a man in a booth who looks at my paperwork, looks at my driver's license, and sends me on my way. And often they're middle-aged Pakistani immigrants. And I know the guy's working in this minimal wage job to support his family. He probably has 2 master's degrees in engineering, which he can't use here. It's not a great life. and he's trying so hard. And I pull up, just another guy coming through, as hundreds and hundreds, and I show him my driver's license. And he looks at it, he does a double take, and he smiles, and he laughs, and he says, "May I show it to my friend in the next booth?" I said, "Of course." And he takes it over, and the two of them have a laugh together, and he brings it back. And a lot of times people say, "You made my day." And one time I was checking into a hotel late at night, and the young desk clerk looked at my license, and he smiled, and a little laugh. And then he looked at me with a very sad expression. He said, "I've had a really rough day." He said, "Thanks, I needed that." And by the way, the name of my second book is "Thanks, I Needed That." And I tell that story. So that's my rabbit. It's helping people laugh. And I'm very, very grateful that I sort of accidentally got into this. Even if I weren't doing professional stand-up, I would still always try and make people laugh appropriately. There are times when you don't make people laugh, of course, but there are appropriate times when you do.
So how did that get you into stand-up comedy professionally?
While I was still serving a congregation, a couple of my friends and I went to a comedy club on a weeknight, just for the heck of it. We had time. And the admission, I think it was $5, but if you agreed to, it was amateur night. If you agreed to get up on stage and do 5 minutes, you got in free. Well, okay. So I knew some jokes, and so I did it. I got up there and I told some jokes, and then I saw the red light blinking, which means get off the stage. And I didn't do great, but I got free admission. So, but it wasn't in the back of my mind. I left my congregation. I earned a doctorate. I was going to do counseling. I opened an office, shared space with a psychiatrist. It was all set in 1986. And that summer, the Jewish Exponent in Philadelphia, where I was, had a little tiny ad, maybe 3 inches high, saying, "Do you think you're funny? If so, enter the Jewish Comic of the Year contest. Tell us in 50 words why you're funny." So I sent in my entry. They had 100 people who entered, knocked it down to 50. They called me and said, "Tell us a joke." On the spot. I told them a joke. I was one of 13 finalists, and we had to do 5 minutes of stand-up at a Philadelphia comedy club, going bananas. And the place was full, supporters of the various contestants. And they knew I was a rabbi. I was only a rabbi. I walked out on the stage wearing a pulpit robe, spread my arms as wide as I could, and said, "Try not to think of me as a rabbi." And that's how I began my comedy career. I ultimately came in third behind a chiropractor and a lawyer. But the chiropractor was dirty. The lawyer went over his time, so I felt I was the legitimate winner. And one of the celebrity judges was a woman named Liz Starr. She was the hostess of AM Philadelphia, the top-rated morning TV show. She thought I should have won, and she told me so. And she ultimately had me on her show. And prior to that, she had a camera crew come and film me performing at a comedy club. And I think I did 10 minutes, of which a minute was worthwhile. But there we were. And that really launched what became, within a couple of years, a career.
So a rabbi, a chiropractor, and a lawyer walk into a comedy club and take it from there.
Right. And they compete. And of the three, only one of them is a full-time professional comedian.
I ask because my granddaughter is beginning to do stand-up in clubs.
Okay.
And she's just starting, so she's going through some of the same stuff. Yeah. It's interesting.
It's a dream. I've got a 75-year-old, my cousin's husband. He just retired from a university position. He's a PhD, and what does he want to do? He wants to become a stand-up comic. A lot of people want, but tell your granddaughter, I'm sure she knows she's going to fail That's part of the game, but to keep at it and
Oh, yeah.
to tell her, use her material, try every chance she gets when she's in a supermarket. If she runs into somebody she knows, she's got to tell that person a joke or try every chance she gets, because it builds up, the timing, the delivery, the editing of her jokes to make sure they're as succinct as possible. Um, I've got a lot of advice for young comedians, but um, I was uh, at a Vermont comedy contest a year ago, a Vermont comedy festival. I live in Vermont, of course, a Vermont comedy festival where, as part of the festival, they had a contest, and there were 20 comedians plus myself. We all had to do 1 minute in each successive round until the finals. And these young comedians, and I was like 50 years older than the next oldest comedian. They all were so full of themselves. They'd get up on stage. Well, I don't know what I'm going to talk about. I think I'll talk about my girlfriend. No, that just doesn't work. That's lazy. And I came up with my prepared material. And of the 21 of us, I won the contest. And because you have to look like you're just winging it, just doing improv, but actually you need to be prepared, edit, and share that with your granddaughter, because I know, those are some of the tricks of the trade.
I watched a couple of videos of you performing. In contrast to a lot of stand-ups now, your humor is gentle. How do you find your material? How do you make gentle funny?
I think, first of all, because I've lived a long life and had a lot of experiences, my material comes from places that no one else can touch. When you listen to comedy club comics, the themes just keep repeating themselves. I just broke up with my girlfriend. I don't have any money. I live with my parents. Here's the difference between New York and LA. I have a broken down car. I got drunk the other day. The same over and over and over again, told differently. My material, I can talk and draw from being an adult, being married for 55 years, having grown children, having raised teenage children, being a rabbi, conducting services, weddings, funerals, traveling to Israel, having a dog that came from Puerto Rico. I've got a lot of material, so I can pick and choose. And I'm always aware of the fact that I want everyone to enjoy themselves. And I don't want them to leave the event saying, I laughed, but I felt guilty. And when a comedian is really dirty, people will laugh, but they'll feel guilty. I don't want that to happen. I want people to just feel good. Another thing I would cite is I'm very concerned about everyone in the audience. And years ago, I had a manager. I stopped using her after a while, but I was doing a show in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in the 90s. And my manager told me she was speaking with the chairwoman of the event. And she said, "Oh, is Bob going to do his joke about the wedding procession?" And my manager knew exactly what was going on, told me about it. And here's the thing. I used to do a joke where I'd say I officiated so many weddings, and almost all the couples would choose the song from Fiddler on the Roof, Sunrise, Sunset. And it always amused me to see a 250-pound bride walk down the aisle to, Is This the Little Girl I Carried? And, it got a good laugh. It's a funny joke. But when my manager said the woman she talked to, whom she'd never met, asked about that joke, I knew exactly that this was a woman with a weight problem. And she found that joke to be not funny, maybe painful, probably painful. And she wasn't demanding, she was just asking. Well, from the point of when I heard that from my manager, I never, ever did that joke again. And when it came time to take my cassette, which I had recorded, and transfer it over to a DVD, I edited out that joke because I don't want anybody to feel bad. I just want people to laugh. And the best example of what I do and what I really call the holiness of laughter took place after a show when a woman who I knew was dying of cancer came up to me. She said, she said, for an hour and a half, I forgot I was sick. And, to be in a position to be able to help a woman who's dying of cancer not feel sick for an hour and a half, what a privilege.
So there is a holiness in laughter.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Like many stand-ups, you've got to get some hecklers once in a while. How do you handle that?
Fortunately, I don't.
Oh, really?
I do pre-heckle work, which means when I do a show, I get to the venue beforehand and make sure the room is set up properly. And many a time I've been in a synagogue auditorium and they've set up the tables far apart from each other, maybe with a buffet in the middle. And I say, I can't perform this way. Let's move the tables. Then I'll start moving the tables. I get good exercise doing that, pulling the tables so they're close together. I always send out instructions ahead of time that the people should be sitting close to one another and close to me. If I'm doing stand-up and there's somebody comes in late and they sit in the back, no matter how funny I am, no matter how great a sense of humor they have, they will not laugh if they're sitting alone. It just doesn't happen. So people need to sit, the room needs to be set up properly. And if it's not set up properly, that's as painful as a heckler because you can do whatever you want and you're not, the stuff is not going to work. So I prearrange that. Second thing is, I would do comedy clubs. You don't have that ability, but usually the comedy club owners, managers will set it up so that people are sitting in the right place. But in comedy clubs, sometimes people are drunk. I have one heckle line. If somebody's heckling, and I say, "Excuse me, sir, would you mind leading us in the silent prayer?" So I've used that maybe twice, and it works. But if the guy continues, I'm dead because I don't have a backup line. So hecklers, I've not had hecklers, although I've had situations that have been dreadful, and it's because of the room setup. I call those shows a pat your chest show. I was doing a corporate event, and I worked with the secretary of the owner of the corporation to set up the room, and I talked to her maybe 10 times. And I got there, and it was completely wrong. They had 4 little tables in the front, a huge wide space behind me, and an open bar in the back, and nothing was working. And that's what I call a pat your chest show, which means I'm in the middle, I'm doing my act, I'm going straight down the toilet, and any other comedian would do the same thing. And I at one point, I just pat my chest, and I can feel in the inside pocket of my blazer the envelope with my check. It's right there. So I'm being paid for this, and that makes it somewhat all right. But I heard about Robert Klein once did a huge show. He got out there and the place was totally wrong and people were talking. And he said, "Nah, I'm not going to do this." And he gave him their check back. So it's the room setup is critical, and that's what I call the hecklers. So.
One of your books, Life Doesn't Get Any Better Than This, The Holiness of Little Daily Dramas. One of the chapters begins talking about how to segue into a rabbinate from the introduction. My father used to take showers with the lady next door.
I knew you'd pick that.
How's that one of the chapters?
Yeah. I'll tell you what the chapter is all about, and then I'll talk about how, the grabber, in my preaching, I'll start with this. When I give sermons, I don't use humor all the way through. I give very serious sermons, But you have to get people's attention. It's important to get people. And so I often, but not always, would start like this. After I left my congregation in Philadelphia, I conducted high holiday services for about 400 people for 33 years in Philadelphia. One year, Rosh Hashanah, I began the sermon. For the last 2 weeks, my wife and son were in Peru on vacation. I stayed home to write sermons and prepare for the high holy days. You're welcome. So, place cracked up. And then I launched into my serious sermon. But that's how I communicate. And most of my stories start with something that's going to get people's attention and they're going to want to read. Now, that story, my father used to take showers with the lady next door, is a story. It's a holiday story. It talks about how we lived in a house in Providence, Rhode Island, where I grew up, what was called a duplex. They'd call them townhouses now. 3 floors and a basement on each side of one house. And it turns out that the Wynn family, and Ruth Wynn and her family, moved in next door. And my father and Ruth Wynn realized that they were taking their morning showers at the same time in the bathrooms that were back to back, separated by a wall. So occasionally they'd knock on the wall. And that's how my father took showers with the lady next door. The story goes on to talk about my friendship with their son and how during the December, during Hanukkah, I'd walk to school with Cooper, his name, and tell him about the gifts I got the night before, every night at the eight nights, which was great until Christmas morning. And I'd go over to their house and I'd see their living room strewn with presents, and that's how kids were back then. The story goes on to talk about Hanukkah as we celebrated it, good times and particularly bad times, and how my father was unemployed one year, and my parents explained to me, probably 8 years old, that I wouldn't be getting presents this year. I just couldn't afford it. But on the last night of Hanukkah, they said, "You've been so understanding," and they gave me a gift, a little model toy boat, which probably cost $1.95 for my toy model collection. And I said, of all the presents all over the years, that's the one I remember. And it meant a lot to me back then. And still, when I think about it all these years later, it means a lot to me. So it's a serious story. It's a poignant story, but it begins by getting the reader's attention. And by the way, both of my books are available through Amazon. Just go to Amazon and put Robert Alper, and you'll see all my books. Happy to sell the books.
You really want to sell books? Something you said earlier just clicked in my mind. The Puerto Rican dog?
Yeah.
Speak Spanish?
Actually, he spoke English, and we got him from a dog rescue. Our old dog died, and we decided to get another used dog, as I say in my act, another used dog. And we looked through the pictures and saw Barney, who looked a lot like our old dog, about a 50-pound mongrel. And he came from Puerto Rico. His history was the litter was found. The mother had been killed. A group rescued the litter and took care of them for a few months. And then they shipped them off to New Hampshire to be fostered. And when they were about 6 months old, they put them up for adoption. So we picked him out. He looked great. And we drove an hour and a half to New Hampshire, and we got him. And he died a couple of years ago. He was a wonderful dog. But as I say in my comedy act, the problem was when he arrived, he came with the name Jesus. And, Jewish family, dog named Jesus. So we decided to compromise and we called him Zeus. And then if we had to get his attention, we'd say, "Hey, Zeus." But
I asked because our dog is his mother was a Russian show dog. So
really?
He is forever standing up and walking around the apartment.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
Barney he was a great dog. We didn't call him, so we called him Barney. And he had this great trick, which is on YouTube actually. If you go to YouTube and put in Rabbi Bob Alper, there's like 50 different YouTubes people can watch. But there's one where I have my dog and I say, it turns out he's from Puerto Rico, but it turns out he's Jewish because he observes Jewish dietary rules. And I have standing in front of me. I take out a biscuit and I put it in front of his face, and he starts going for it. And I say, no, Barney, that's treif, which means not kosher. That's treif. And he sort of puts his head down. Then I look at the biscuit again and say, oh, wait a minute, it's kosher. And he gobbles it down. And then I continue. I say, and he also respects other religions, for example, Islam. And I hold out a biscuit. I say, haram means not permitted. I hold out a biscuit, he goes for it. I say, now, Barney, that's haram. And he turns his face away. I say, oh, wait a minute, it's halal. And he eats it. And then I finish the bit by saying, and even Christianity. And I hold out a biscuit, and he goes for it. And I say, now, Barney, that's tasty. He turns away. I say, oh, wait a minute, it's bland. And then he eats it.
that's a good intro to a couple of questions I wanted to ask you about your programs. You have a couple that interested me. The first was called Spirituality of Laughter. Why Jews are so funny.
Right. Yeah, I do. I mean, my two major programs is an evening of stand-up comedy. For example, I did it at last fall at the Villages in Florida. It's the largest retirement community in the world. We had about 650 people at the Villages at the Sharon Morse Performing Arts Center. It was a great audience, and what a magnificent place to perform. A week before I was there, they had Jay Leno, and the week after the Kathleen Madigan. So I was in good company. So I do an 80-minute or 70, 80-minute stand-up comedy. And then the other program, which I actually did the next day at a synagogue nearby, is that Spirituality of Laughter, which is a lecture about humor. It's a lecture, but it's not a dry one. It's at least 2 belly laughs a minute. So it's infused with humor, but I talk about why Jews are funny, humor in the Bible, humor in the Talmud, the value of humor, even humor during the Holocaust. I touch all kinds of subjects. Why Jews are funny, why Protestants are not funny. I talk about that. And that's a funny bit, actually. Turns out they are funny, but that's part of the lecture. Talk about why Muslims are not funny or are funny. And I quote my Muslim colleagues, who I work with a bunch of very funny Muslim comedians, and talk about do some of their material. So it's an hour and a half program called The Spirituality of Laughter, and I love doing both of them. Either.
And you did a show with the audience had 2,000 Muslims.
Yeah, because of my work, which started in 2002, doing shows with Arab and Muslim comedians, which we call the Laugh and Peace Tour. I think around 2012 or something, I was invited to perform in Toronto at Toronto's Muslim Fest. I think it was the first one they did. They keep doing it every year. And they had a few younger Muslim comedians did some time, and then I was like the headliner, and it was about 2,000 people. So I'm out there. I'm a rabbi in Toronto on a stage with a mic in front of 2,000 Muslims. And I looked out at the audience. I said, I feel so alone here, totally strange, very much out of place. I said, think of it. All of you are Canadians, and I'm American. And the place rocked. Terrific audience.
We need more of that.
Yeah, especially now.
My wife and I were fortunate enough to go to China. And when you interact with the people, It's so different than when governments interact.
Yeah.
We're pretty much all the same.
Yeah. I did tons, it's not happening now, unfortunately, because things have changed terribly. But I did tons and tons of college shows with my Muslim colleagues, and they were wonderful. We did a show in Riverside, California, University of California, Riverside campus, and they told us that the week before there was some graffiti around campus. It's maybe 10 years ago, and some bad feelings going on between Jews and Muslims. We did the show, and it was co-sponsored by Jews and Muslims. And the Muslim kids were selling tickets, and the Jewish kids were giving out the food. And I looked out, and I see girls in hijabs and boys in yarmulkes sitting together and laughing together and partying together. Laughter brings people together. It really does. Another time we did a show at Georgia Tech. And before the show, we were backstage, and the president of the Muslim Student Association and the president of Hillel were talking within my hearing, and they were talking about where they were going to go for dinner that night together. And I found out, they told me later on, that even though their offices were next door to each other in the student union, before they started working on this show, they'd never spoken to one another. And now they're going to hang out for dinner. It's laughter that can bring people together. We use the phrase, when people laugh together, they can't hate each other.
My dog in the background.
Oh, okay.
He's got to supervise all podcasts.
Okay.
And we probably should talk about what's going on with the protests in New York and the anti-Semitic vandalism that's going on now.
Yeah.
How do you stop this?
It's very scary. It's very scary. I mean, the exhibit in New York with the remnants of the Nova Fest down on Wall Street. My wife and I went to that, and it's very, very painful to see, very moving, and people should go there. They extended it. How useful idiots can stand outside and protest something like that, I have no idea how that happens. It's comforting to know that most people, understand that these are useful idiots who have no idea what they're talking about. I've seen interviewers interview some of the students, and they said, "You're yelling from the river to the sea. What river and what sea?" And the girls looks at the Aegean. Yeah, they have no idea what they're talking about. A friend of mine did a video at Columbia, and she lives right there. I mean, her apartment windows are literally above the encampment on 16th and Amsterdam. And she was walking around with her camera while they were protesting, and got to one young woman who's wearing a hijab and a mask. And she's filming her. And the young woman looks at my friend, said, "I would ask you not to film me." And my friend said, "Wait a minute, you're out here protesting in public. This is a public area." And the girl, she says, "It makes me uncomfortable." Well, she's standing there beating a drum under the window of a person who lives there, but to be photographed makes her uncomfortable. I mean, this is the mindset. Anyway, I don't have the answer, but and it's very worrisome. And to me, one of the most worrisome things, I'm a Vermonter, and my senator is Bernie Sanders. And I always say when Bernie was running for president, and there were a lot of Democrats running for president, Bernie was my second favorite. And people say, who's your favorite? And I said, all the others. Here's a guy who, I'm going to get on my high horse here, but here's a guy who cannot open his mouth without talking about how he's Jewish. Yeah, that's his get out of jail free card. I'm Jewish. He's Jewish. But I've written to him, I think 4 or 5 times, emailed, written letters, said, Bernie, you're calling for a ceasefire. That's great. We all believe in a ceasefire. What does Israel do then when Hamas has said, we will destroy you, every man, woman, and child in Israel? That's our goal. And if you thought October 7th was terrible, we're going to give you October 7th after October 7th after October 7th. How does Israel deal with that? And he never answers me because he knows he doesn't have the answer. Anyway,
Yeah.
that's my son.
Anyway, you recently returned from a trip to Albania.
Right?
Interesting story, as Albania was a contender for a Jewish state before World War II.
Yeah, people don't know that. There were strong, positive negotiations going on for Jews from Europe to go to Albania as a place of refuge and to become Albanians. It fell apart, of course, when the war started. But here's a couple things that every person I've asked, no one knows this. But of all the countries in Europe, every country behaved differently during the war. Norway saved almost all of its Jews. France, the police were complicit. They loved rounding up Jews. Croatia, 85% of the Jews who were killed in Croatia were killed not by the Nazis, but by their neighbors. Latvia, Lithuania, horrible. The stories are horrible. Albania is the only country in Europe whose Jewish population was tiny. They had about 200 Jews living in Albania at the beginning of the war. At the end of the war, they had some 2,000 to 3,000 Jews living in Albania. Because all the Jews who came to Albania from neighboring Kosovo, Greece, Italy, they were saved. The people rescued them. They welcomed them. They put them up in their homes. They dressed them in peasant garb so that the Italians who were occupying Albania at the beginning, the Germans who occupied Albania at the end of the war, would not find them. The Nazis demanded lists of Jews. The Albanians said, no, we're not giving them to you. There's a phrase, an Albanian concept called besa, which means if somebody comes to you seeking refuge, you must take care of them. You must. And there's a book called Besa. It's still available. And it's a picture book of about 70 or 80 rescuers of Jews or their descendants. And in each of them, they talk about Besa. And here's the other thing that I think is so fascinating that I really wish the world could know. Of all the countries in Europe, the one country where the Jews were saved, thrived, and welcomed as a place of refuge, the one country, Albania, is the only majority Muslim country in Europe. Think about that. And so I went to Albania. We have very dear Albanian friends, and their family took wonderful care of me while I was there for the week. And among other things, I went to there's a little tiny Jewish museum in a town called Barat, and there's a monument in the biggest park in Tirana, the capital city, with 3 sections. One is in Albanian, one is in Hebrew, and one is in English, talking about how in Albania all of the Jews were kept safe, and many, many more, 10 times more, were saved and rescued. So it's a story. It's such an uplifting story. And particularly when you talk about Jewish-Muslim relations, it's an uplifting story people need to know. And my goal is to tell more people. Thank you for letting me tell it on your podcast.
I'm glad you did. Anything we missed talking about?
Well, I always talk in my act. Another thing I mention always is that I live in Vermont. I'm really lucky to live here, and gives me a lot more material. And one of the jokes I use is here in Vermont we have Jewish farmers. They're pretty easy to spot. In the summer, they drive tractors with Florida license plates. Or they say, we're able to ski during the weekdays, if we live here full time. And even when you're alone, you have to double up on the lifts. So I skied up one time and I yelled, "Single, single," and I heard a voice behind me say, "Ever wonder why?" And for your older listeners, I always begin, especially in comedy clubs, I say, you may be seeing history made here, because I might be the oldest comedian ever to perform on this stage. I said, I'm 79 years old. My hero is Harrison Ford. He's 82. He'll be 82 next month. He's making another movie. It's going to be called Indiana Jones and the Enlarged Prostate. And that's how we start off. The joke continues, by the way. There's two more parts to it. I say they're going to test market that title. If that doesn't resonate with the audience, the backup title is Indiana Jones and the Reverse Mortgage. And then I say, and he's got another project after that film wraps. Remember The Fugitive, the movie The Fugitive? So in this newest episode, Dr. Richard Kimball flees assisted living.
Assisted living you can get out of, not as easily as independent, but
right.
There is a way to go.
Yeah.
Bob, this has been terrific. I really appreciate you being on the podcast. It's been fun. It's been enlightening, and I thank you again.
Thank you very much for having me. You're a great interviewer, and I've had different. I had one interview, the guy wouldn't stop talking. I got a few words edgewise, but I really appreciate when a person is skilled and is able to draw out the good things that I know the answers to. And it's been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate it.
This show isn't about me. It's about you. It's about the guests. Right. So I learned that from watching Johnny Carson in the old days. Right. Thanks again, Bob.
You're welcome. Thank you. Take care.
If you found this podcast interesting, fun, or helpful, tell your friends and family, and click on the follow or subscribe button. We'll let you know when new episodes are available. You've been listening to Specifically for Seniors. We'll talk more next time. Stay connected.